This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Demonstrators defy curfews as protests against police brutality continue across the U.S. South Africa set to ease its lockdown to level 3 from the 1st of June. And on World No Tobacco Day, we examine the risks COVID-19 poses to smokers and tobacco farmers in Zimbabwe. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to you live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers. Here are more stories making headlines. In your sport news, Football Kenya Federation's decision to cancel the 2019-2020 league season challenged in court. We begin in New York City, where the protests over police brutality and racial inequality have turned violent. Protesters clashed with officers and set fire to vehicles and buildings. People were hurt during the confrontations. Despite curfews set in most major American cities, demonstrations continued through Saturday night. Meanwhile, U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien says the Trump administration will not invoke federal authority over the National Guard for now. Thousands of National Guard troops have already mobilized in Minneapolis, and O'Brien says enforcement decisions should rest with state governors. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by CGTN's Giles Gibson, who is in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, Giles. Giles, even with some of the measures being put in place to curb violence and some of the protests that we've seen, the situation seems to be escalating. Give us an update of what's happening in various parts of the U.S. right now, and in particular in Washington, D.C., where you are.
Well, we've seen protests breaking out in about 75 or perhaps more cities right across this country. That includes Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, which is of course where these protests really started, and then here in Washington, D.C. as well. The protest in Washington, D.C. that started on Saturday afternoon local time and then went through into the early hours of Sunday morning really started pretty peacefully. You had lots of people marching down the streets around the White House and near the U.S. Congress building, near Capitol Hill, with signs and banners, making their anger about the death of George Floyd and countless other black men and women over the years, making that anger pretty felt and put across. I think what then changed was when darkness started to fall. That's really when we saw some much uglier scenes. We saw small pockets of these protesters getting into clashes with the police right outside the gates of the White House. We then saw a fire breaking out really just a block or two away from the White House. So really it was peaceful at the start, and then some of the sort of uglier scenes and some looting in parts of the city started as it got darker.
Well, the National Guard says it's already deployed 5,000 personnel in 15 states in the capital to deal with the unrest. Can you share with us what you're hearing about why the National Guard was brought in and what the reaction to their presence has been?
Yeah, I think it's really important what you mentioned there, the fact that the National Security Advisor has been saying in the last few hours that they are not going to so-called federalize the National Guard. That means that these National Guard troops in all of these different states where we have these ugly scenes breaking out, they are still going to be under the control of the governors and of state authorities rather than centrally from here in Washington. We have had a little bit of reaction now. We've been waiting throughout the morning for reaction from President Trump. He's put out a couple of tweets. He's congratulated the National Guard for the way they managed the situation in the city of Minneapolis. And he's also said that he's going to make Antifa a terrorist organization. Now, Antifa is this left-wing militant group that Donald Trump, the US president, is blaming a lot of these protests on. I have to say, having seen the scenes here in Washington and right across the country, this is not just a very small group of people. This is a large swathe of American society coming out onto the streets and making their feelings felt about police brutality and about racial inequality in this country.
Thank you so much for joining us, Giles. That was Giles Gibson joining us live from Washington, D.C. We're nearly 1 week after protests in the U.S. Some people in Europe are showing solidarity with the protesters' message. In London, hundreds of people gathered at Trafalgar Square for a Black Lives Matter rally. They marched up to the Houses of Parliament and the U.S. Embassy. Elsewhere in Berlin, several hundred protesters also staged a rally outside the American Embassy.
The death of George Floyd is causing anger here in Germany as well. About 1,000 people have gathered in a southern district of the German capital, Berlin, to voice their outrage. Not much social distancing going on here, I have to say. The police fairly relaxed about that as well. This follows a protest earlier in the day of similar size, we're told, about 1,000 people outside the US Embassy here in the German capital. The protesters here come from all kinds of backgrounds. There doesn't appear overtly to be any particular political movement or banner behind them, organised in both cases by a private citizen. And their message is very much that this might be a domestic issue, but that the issue of racial equality is something that angers people here in Europe as well. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Berlin.
About 1,000 people are shot to death by police officers in the U.S. every year, and that's according to a database maintained by the Washington Post. Research shows that the victims are more likely to be African Americans and Hispanics. Others who kill on duty very seldom face criminal charges, claiming they were acting out in self-defense. CGTN's Xu Huao examines the growing frustration in these minority communities.
Running, screaming, lamenting. This is not drama. This is the exhausted crying out of outraged African American people for change. They've had enough of losing another friend or family member for no reason.
We want justice. We want, the officer to be held accountable for his actions. That is what we want. That is all we want.
Black Americans say they're fed up with not being listened to over racial inequality, and they continue to protest. The deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in March are just the latest in the growing list.
The treatment of Black people in America is ridiculous. It is not okay at all. It is just very, very sad, and this has been going on for way too many years.
In July 2014, New York City police officers arrested Eric Garner, an unarmed black man, on suspicion of illegally selling cigarettes. At least 4 officers pressed him to the ground, even as he repeatedly cried, "I can't breathe." He would later die from a heart attack. A month later, black teenager Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. It sparked massive protests across the country.
We march because Michael Brown mattered. We march because Eric Garner mattered. We march because our children matter.
In July 2016, Philando Castillo was shot dead by a police officer during a traffic stop.
And the police he's covered. He killed my boyfriend.
His girlfriend immediately opened the Facebook live stream and recorded everything. Castillo's death prompted former U.S. President Barack Obama to admit that a broader set of racial disparities existed in the country's criminal justice system.
It's been way too many times where we've had to peacefully protest. We've had to come with our signs and we're never seeing results. We never get a conviction when it's a black life against a white police officer.
With mounting frustration, the protests go on. However, many are using violent and destructive means to express it. And that's something which authorities say they have zero tolerance for.
All of the people that are in the streets protesting, you have every absolute right to be angry, to be upset, to be mad, to express your anger. However, you have no right to perpetrate violence and harm on the very communities that you say that you are standing up for.
At the press conference, Jenkins went on to give a heartbreaking rendition of a well-known Christian hymn. You can't help thinking it's going to take amazing grace on all sides to reconcile this situation.
Well, we're now going to take a short break and return. More stories coming up. Somalia launches investigations into the death of 7 aid workers in the country. And on World No Tobacco Day, we examine the risk COVID-19 poses to smokers and farmers in Zimbabwe. Welcome back. South Africa has enforced some of the strictest lockdown measures on the continent. The country recently announced that the nationwide lockdown would move to a level 3 starting Monday. For more on this, we're joined by CGTN's Angela Coppola in Johannesburg. Angela, thank you so much for joining us. Well, the Education Minister held a press briefing earlier today. Can you give us some key points shared in that briefing, Angela?
Well, the interesting thing is that briefing was set to go ahead, and at the very last minute, the Minister, Angie Macheka, actually postponed the session until Monday. And that's because some of the unions involved in the education sector, that's the teachers' union, there's a students' union, and then a education workers' union, had all decided that they were probably going to boycott the first day of school for those 2 grades, the grade 7s and the grade 12s. Who are going back to school tomorrow. So as it stands right now, they were saying that there wasn't enough PPE provided for them and for the workers. The school boards, of course, are sitting on the sidelines now waiting for some clarity from the Department of Basic Education to see what's going on. And buses of kids are already starting to move, and have been during the course of the day, to move towards the schools to go and get settled in. So we have a situation here where nobody knows quite what's going on. But the bottom line is that kids who don't have the resources, those are the poorer kids, don't have the ability to go and do online schooling, while those in the private schools and the more well-off have that ability. And that's always something that the Minister has tried to avoid, is having one set of rules for the less privileged and one set of rules and starting dates for the more privileged. So we'll have to wait and see until 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, in fact, what the situation is with the Minister and whether she's resolved her arguments and tried to solve the problems that the unions are facing at the moment.
Angela, what more can you tell us about the easing of restrictions that are due to take effect from tomorrow, essentially?
Well, we do know that there are 4 airports that are going to be opened up for domestic travel only. That's OR Tambo in Johannesburg, the Durban Airport, the Cape Town Airport, and then the second airport in Johannesburg. So those are going to be open. We're hoping the schools are going to be opening apparently for those 2 grades. We do know that some 8 million people are going to be going back to work as of tomorrow. There's going to be traffic congestion, so we're getting back to normal with that. The retail and manufacturing sectors are going to be going up to full strength now. You won't be able to go into bars and restaurants, unfortunately. The mines, of course, are ramping up to around 100% in the next couple of weeks. They have been at 50% or so in the build-up to 1 June. The office workers, of course, have been asked to stay at home for now, because if they can work from home, it's going to make it a lot less stressful and there'll be a lot less exposure to the virus. Obviously now with everything ramping up, we're going to probably see more opportunity or more risk of load shedding as Eskom can't manage to deal with the increased production that's going to be happening. The good news for some is that the bottle stores are going to be opening, but they can't buy cigarettes for those who do smoke. And we heard that some of the churches have been given the opportunity to open, but most of them have said they're going to wait a bit because, especially in the hotspots around the country, they don't want to generate or create more infections. So as it stands right now, it's almost back to normal, except for a couple of issues that are still outstanding. Hannah?
Thank you so much, Angela. So many aspects, so many layers to this. We'll wait to see as it unfolds. Well, let's move on to other news that's making headlines on the continent. At least 333 Ethiopians, among them children, have arrived back in their home country from Lebanon. Most of them had been employed by various Lebanese companies and families. However, as the coronavirus takes its toll on Lebanon's economy, many have been rendered jobless. Their arrival is part of the Ethiopian government's efforts to bring back its citizens who are stranded in foreign countries as a result of the pandemic. There are some 150,000 Ethiopian women who are employed as domestic workers in the Middle East, according to some statistics. Some of the returnees have spoken about their relief at being back home.
There is serious hard currency scarcity. Many people have no job. We are working for them without salary, but it didn't last long and they started abandoning us in the streets.
The problems out there are many. There are no jobs. Many Ethiopians live in small rented houses. There's nothing to eat or drink, and generally we are suffering, and a lot more people are there in the same situation.
Per the UN resolution and also the African Union communique, one of the ways to get the COVID-19 virus under control is to restrict movement. So the recommendation is to actually assist citizens where they are instead of moving them. But when we find the most vulnerable ones, like the ones that came today, we do repatriation, but it would be in a very small number. Instead, we're working with the international community, the government and other institutions to actually assist our citizens in the countries where they're residing right now.
A boat carrying 101 migrants attempting to travel to Europe has been intercepted on the Libyan coastal city of Garibaldi. The migrants were immediately taken to a security checkpoint in Qom City, some 120 kilometers east of Tripoli. The Government of National Accord's Interior Ministry says the migrants will later on be transported to a detention center. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in 2011, Libya's western coast has become a main departure point for migrants bound to Europe, fleeing war and poverty. Many migrants are still attempting the crossing of the Mediterranean Sea despite the closure of Libya's international borders due to the coronavirus pandemic. Last week, Libya's Coast Guard stopped nearly 400 migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean. On to Somalia now, where the authorities there are trying to piece together information after 8 people, including health workers, were executed near Mogadishu. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo has that report.
The killings took place north of Mogadishu. Locals say masked men in military uniform abducted 8 people, among them 7 health workers, before killing them. The 7 were working for the Zemzem Foundation, a local non-governmental organization. Golole is an agricultural town on the outskirts of Balad, some 30 kilometers north of Mogadishu.
I have been living there for the past 60 years. Those killed were our children. We took them to university and brought them back to support the community. They were ambushed and killed by men in military uniform. Our children are not Al-Shabaab.
I lost my son. I also lost his colleagues who treated me as their uncle and grandfather. We are innocent civilians who practice farming for survival. Whatever happened here in our village is beyond imagination. Nothing of this sort has ever happened in all my years of existence.
The government has condemned the attack, despite locals linking the murder to members of the Somali army. Lawmakers hailing from the region have called for a swift investigation into the mass murder.
The killings will not go unsolved. We will ensure proper investigation is done, and those found responsible must face the law. The young people were killed in a horrible way. It's a sad day for us all.
Abductions and targeting of humanitarian and medical workers is a common thing in Somalia. Militant group Al-Shabaab has in the past been labeled as the biggest culprit, as it seeks funds to sustain its operations. 3 days prior to the attack, several government soldiers were killed in Golole village in a deadly roadside blast. Community leaders have suggested that the attack might have been an act of revenge following the deaths of the soldiers. Militant group Al-Shabaab has lost control of towns and villages across much of the country, but the group continues to inflict heavy losses on government troops. Meanwhile, as investigations begin, there are concerns that the latest execution of health workers will deal a huge blow to government's efforts of combating terrorism. Abdulaziz Bilon, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Well, COVID-19 has added fresh impetus to a global campaign to ban tobacco, as some experts believe damage caused by fumes from cigarettes increase the chance of succumbing to the virus. CGTN's Farai Mokatuya examines the risk of COVID-19 to smokers and farmers who depend on tobacco for their livelihoods.
Smokers have long been cautioned about the hazards of their habit. Now the deadly pandemic has amplified the warnings.
So normally, if you have smoked for a long time, anything more than 5 to 10 years, your lungs are beginning to get damaged. And knowing that COVID-19 is a respiratory illness sort of compounds the potential for severe disease in smokers. So if a smoker with emphysema gets COVID-19, they are going to probably need ICU, probably need ventilation, and they'll probably recover slower than somebody with healthy lungs.
But some smokers aren't ready to quit.
Everyone is at risk of contracting COVID-19 because at some point they will remove their masks and come into contact with other people. For example, when they're going to buy food. I know many people who started smoking in their youth and died at old age from other causes. There are so many other things that can kill you. It's not only tobacco.
The pandemic has caused complications for those who rely on earnings from the golden leaf.
The sales floor were meant to open in February, but only opened towards May. That brought our operations to a standstill because we did not have money to pay our workers.
It was a very big gap.
Seed beds for 30 hectares of new crop were meant to be made up by now, but are still work in progress. Land preparation has also lagged.
Next season is already 3 months behind.
That could have a bearing on the quantity and quality of next year's crop, which may lower returns for farmers already facing additional expenses.
We don't have thermometers, masks and sanitizers, and we don't have the money to buy them until we make our first sales. Right now, we are putting ourselves and our workers at high risk.
And that will put further scrutiny on operations that are under intense pressure to be stopped. Farai Mokatuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Time now for your sport news. We cross to Kenya, where the decision by the country's football federation to cancel the 2019-2020 season due to COVID-19 has been challenged in court. This is the latest dispute between Football Kenya Federation and the Kenyan Premier League Limited, the company that manages the domestic top-flight league. Here's CGTN's Muhammad Abubakar with the details.
Since the suspension of the Kenyan Premier League in March, players from majority of the 18 clubs have been under financial strain. However, Tusker FC, one of the few professionally run teams in the country, has ensured that all staff are taken care of.
In terms of their welfare, I think Tusker is one of the teams that have kept all the players on their payrolls, and everyone is receiving their salaries as they've been doing previously. All the players are on medical cover. I'm talking about the players and the technical bench as well.
The 2016 champions were on the hunt for a 12th domestic title and trailing leaders Gor Mahia by 8 points with a game in hand before the league was suspended. With uncertainty hanging over the decision to cancel the season, Tusker is using social media to monitor its players' fitness.
We monitor the progress of what they're doing at home via WhatsApp, whereby periodically everyone is sending a video of what they're doing at home, just to give us some, some comfort that they're doing something. But besides that, we have a program that is being run on the kind of exercises that they need to be engaged in on a daily basis.
As the court case challenging the decision to end the 2019-20 season continues, the Tusker boss is questioning the possibility of a restart with the rise in COVID-19 infections in Kenya.
Still struggling with how practical it will be to restart the league, given the time that we have now, because you need about 6 weeks of pre-season to enable us to be able to be ready for the league, the next season that was scheduled to begin in August. But if the new seasons, the commencement of the new season is going to be pushed backwards, then probably we can still talk about there's a possibility of completing the rounds, the 3 rounds of games that was still remaining or pending.
With football resuming in other parts of Africa and Europe, the fate of the Kenyan Premier League is now a matter of wait and see. Mohamed Abubakar, CGTN.
In motorsports, there's some good news as Formula One announced plans to stage 2